Technical Sergeant Seymour Golub was a combat engineer under Lieutenant General George S. Patton from 1943 to 1945. In that capacity, he defused over 2,000 explosive devices as the Third Army advanced toward Berlin. At Eichstätt, outside of Nuremberg, the site of massive Nazi rallies and the war crimes trials of 1946, Golub masterfully blew open the booby-trapped bank vault containing important Nazi documents, including the infamous Nuremberg Laws that institutionalized anti-Semitism in the Third Reich. As well, Sergeant Golub was involved in the recovery of the mysterious holy relic venerated by Adolf Hitler, an ancient spear which the Nazi leader believed endued its owner with supernatural powers. His skill with explosives preserved for posterity these important artifacts and earned him high praise from General Patton. This is his story.
My father is Seymour Golub. My father was born in 1924 in Brooklyn, New York. A little bit about his family background. My father's family were from Russian Jews. They came around the turn of the century when there were the big pogroms in Russia, and the big migration of Jews to America were in the range of 1902 to 1905. And that's when I believe my grandparents came. My grandparents were Abraham and Celia Golub. Now, a little background. My father was born in 1924, but he had older siblings. He had sisters that were 9, 12, 15, 18 years older than him. He had a brother that was 21 years old, his brother Frank. His brother Frank, when he was born, was a salesman for a baby carriage company. My father had a $500 carriage, the amount of money to buy a car in 1924. That was the type of carriage that he had. His mother wasn't expecting him. His mother was 47 when he was born. That means my grandmother was born in 1877, just 2 years after the American Civil War. In fact, her husband was older than him. So my family, just my grandparents, date back quite a few years. They thought he was a tumor, but 9 months later, little Seymour the tumor was born. He grew up in Brooklyn. He had 4 older sisters. So in a sense, he grew up with like 5 mothers. He was very bright. His hero was Thomas Edison. He loved science. He loved these things, but he also was a troublemaker. A little background, his sisters were older. Being 15, that would be my Aunt Beatrice, and Sophie, my Aunt Sophie, was 18 years older. So they were off getting married, where my Aunt Frances, who was closest in age to my father, was probably the most protective of her father. My dad would go to school, public school, in the mornings. And then in the afternoons, he would have to go to a religious school. And being the precocious little fellow he was whipped with a cat o' nine tails, which is like a leather strap with 9 pieces of leather, for his behavior. Now, my Aunt Frances, who was very protective of her young brother Seymour, when she heard that my father got whipped with a cat o' nine tails, asked my father where he kept the whip, and then the next day went to school, went to the desk, pulled out the whip, and whipped the teacher in the corner of the room. Now, if you knew my Aunt Frances, it was not an idle threat. She said to the teacher, "If you touch my kid brother again, I'll kill you." That was kind of the environment in Brooklyn those days. My Aunt Beatrice married Ralph Pinkwater, who was pretty much an enforcer for the electricals union. And I was the youngest, I was the only son of the youngest brother, so I kind of loved my protective aunt and uncles who loved my dad very much and loved me. After my father had the issue with his Sunday school teacher, another thing was coming up. He was getting into 8th grade, and he really wanted to go to a very special school to him, which was a technical high school called Brooklyn Tech High School. But he had a teacher at that school that hated his guts so much because of his behavior problems, not because of his academic problems, but because of his behavior problems, would not allow him to take the test. In fact, she said, "Seymour, they will ostracize you." She used very big words because I think she was an English teacher. But it was, again, my Aunt Frances who always stood up for her kid brother, Seymour, who fought and got Seymour the right to take this test. And then when he took the test, he passed the test and was accepted into the school. Now, to understand the school in the time frame, this was 1938. It was the latter years of the Depression, and you had many men that were in key industries in America that were unemployed because of the Great Depression. So many of the teachers there were men out of industry. So there were electricians, there were people in manufacturing. At this school, they had a foundry where they took pig iron and turned it into steel alloys. They also built aircraft at the school. The school, my father described to me, had a elevator that was large enough to take a hook and ladder engine to the top floor of the gymnasium. My father, though he came from kind of a wild and crazy group of guys, he got focused at this school. And he became very focused on basically electronics. They called it the electrical program in those days, and machining. And then 2 years later, when he was 16, at the World's Fair in 1939-40, he won the title of America's Youngest Inventor at the Westinghouse exhibit. The 1939-40 World's Fair was a seminal moment in American history. It was where the United States first introduced television. A lot of the technologies that were going to come into the second half of the 20th century were exposed at that school. It was also just prior to America's entrance into World War II. So it was a big moment. Now, the invention that my dad invented in 1940 is still in use today. And what he invented was the system to turn your car lights automatically when it got dark, using a mercury switch and a photocell. And my father got this really pretty trophy. I believe Westinghouse got the patent on it. But when you go in your cars today, the fact that you don't have to physically turn on the lights was a young Jewish boy from Brooklyn, New York, and that was Golub who did that. He graduated in 1942. And actually, instead of going to Purdue, my dad actually wanted to enlist in the Army. But one of the things you had to do was take your physical and your IQ test. And my father mistook somehow the instructions on the IQ test. And in 1940, he was America's brightest boy. But when he took the IQ test, he scored under 50 and was found to be an imbecile. So he was found inadequate to be in the service, which was a huge stigma, because in 1942, many people in his neighborhood were all going into service. Everyone was either being drafted or enlisting. So there was a great stigma for my dad walking around the streets of Brooklyn, and these old Jewish women would say, "So what's with you, Seymour, you 4F?" So what he did was he fought. He did everything he could to take the test again, to go back into it. And in 1943, he did get accepted into the Army. My father was a combat engineer and was trained in the areas of explosives. He was later with Patton's Third Army with the 12th Corps. He was in a 4-man team. It was the 29th, 49th ETIT Enemy Technical Intelligence Team. Being a young guy from New York, he had a sergeant at the base that probably didn't care for Yankees too much, and certainly Jewish Yankees, because my dad would be very polite and say, "Could you please pass the butter?" And he would say, "Please, please, please, you goddamn Yankees." And because of that, my dad was made orderly of the toilets. My father's duties as latrine orderly was to take straw and gasoline. They had 2, 4, and 8 seat commodes, whatever these systems were. He was to take straw, put it down into the individual holes, and then to put gasoline into these and to burn out the contents. And it was a way of probably killing any of the bacteria and all these things. It was one afternoon where, because in the South there is a lot of humidity, thunderstorms, a lot of moisture, the straw was wet. My father could not get He threw down multiple matches. He could not get the straw to ignite, so he just forgot about it. He put extra gasoline, but he could not get it to light. And then, I guess he said about 10 minutes later, there was a explosion that literally took this 4-seat commode and moved it 2 feet over, belching flames. And he had a officer screaming for him, saying, "Retreat, orderly." He said, "I was sitting here smoking this butt, and I dropped it in, and flame belched out of this head." He said, "Do you know what would have happened to me if I dropped it between my legs?" So my dad really did not like being around this base. So whenever he had a chance, he would go up into the hills above the camp, and because he was kind of a technical guy, he didn't have the same, supervision as some of these other troops over there. One day my father was up in the hills of Tennessee, and he heard this horrible sound. He said, to him it sounded like they were killing children. And what it was a farmer that was castrating his hogs. Now, being a Orthodox boy growing up in Brooklyn, that was a sound he never heard. He never had really any relationship with hogs. So what happened, he met the farmer, and then something happened in his life that changed his life forever. He took my dad into a little wooden building that was full of smoke, and in it he cut off a chunk of ham. And to my dad's dying day, his favorite food was ham steak. He loved ham. He loved that family. He met the wife, he met the children. In those years, there was no electricity in these communities. The family never went to town. Only the father went to town. The children had never seen a radio before. My father was the 20th century coming to the family. He loved eating with the family instead of eating with the nasty sergeant back in the base. So he spent his time as much as he could with the family. They loved him. He shared technology. The technology at that time was radio. And he was beloved by that family. He loved that family. And it was one of his favorite moments. And I believe years later he went back to Tennessee to find the family. They meant a lot to him in his life. In France and in the lower countries of Belgium and Holland, Luxembourg, the Germans had mined the fields very actively. General Patton was moving very quickly across Western Europe, and he wanted to know what kind of mines his tanks, basically his armor would be facing. They also, what they would do, my father explained to me, is they would booby trap the tank mines by putting anti-personnel devices underneath them. So if there was any motion to if there was an attempt to move a anti-tank mine, the individual doing that would be blown up. Around the city of Le Havre, France, my dad had very special memories because the city of Le Havre had a minefield around it 3 miles deep, which meant there was a mine within 3 meters of each other, within about 10 feet out. You can imagine an entire city with a minefield 3 miles deep. They had captured SS troops, and my dad had incorporated the services reluctantly of the SS troops. In fact, my dad told me the story to this one officer. He pulled off his insignia, which was the skull and his other insignias, and took them as a trophy, and said to him, "Ich bin ein Jude," I'm a Jew. And he said if he had a stick or a rock or anything, the hatred he gave my father. But my father was a young guy with a Thompson submachine gun, so told him to get on his hands and knees and taking out the mines. My dad was a very good draftsman. He drew the pictures on every device. Every possible device, he drew the pictures and how to take them apart. And he utilized that to train. Not only did he do it himself, but he trained many other people. Now, pictures were much more important than words because the Allied troops had troops from multiple countries, including Poland and other free peoples. There were the free peoples of Luxembourg and Belgium that came along with the French troops, with the Americans and the British. So his illustrations were key in how to take apart these devices. It was a measure of countermeasure and measure, where my dad explained to me the Americans would require wires to attach detonators to timing devices to explosives. The Germans used common threads, metric threads. But when they knew that the Americans knew how to take apart these devices, what they would do is they would booby trap. If it was six turns on the threads, they would file out 3. So after you turned it 3 times, you were dead. The mines, my dad was especially instrumental in documenting was the Bouncing Betty, which was a device that you stepped on, a small trigger device that would cause a small explosion to set the main charge up to, it was supposed to come up to around waist height. It would make a horrible sound when it came out of the ground, which would cause the individual to run. When they would run, they would be dead, because what it would do, it would shoot approximately 500 BBs out in a horizontal pattern. So the idea was to not only get the person that stepped on it, but any lateral people around it. The other mine that he worked with was the glass mine, where you stepped on a small plate of glass that would set off a nitroglycerin charge that would later set the main charge. It was not set to kill the person, it was to basically cause thousands of shards of glass to go into the legs and groin of the soldier who stepped on it, with the intention that if you have one man that is injured, it's better than killing him, because it takes 3 to 4 men to take them out of the field. At the time, there was no X-ray, there was no technology to detect glass. It was a devious device. One of the devices that had fallen into German hands was a British device, which the British had designed a explosive that looked like a rock, with the thought that a soldier walking along a road, being bored, would kick a pebble or a rock. It was designed enough to blow your foot off. Many of those had fallen into the hands of the Germans, and they had been used against American troops. My dad had, like I mentioned, loved the people of Luxembourg, and one of the things he did was he took out the minds of many dozens of homes in Luxembourg. And it was something he didn't have to do, because they're in the middle of a battle, but because of the love of the people, there are many homes that are now still existing in Luxembourg, because my father basically took out series of mines. Many of these were daisy-chained, where you'd have one tripwire, where there'd be multiple, maybe on 2 sides of the home, a tripwire that could set off the whole string. But only one man could go in, because if another one worked on that same string of daisy mine chains, it could blow the whole string up. And what they would do is they would lace one mine wire to another, to another, to another. And if you read the manuals, you're not supposed to take these devices apart. You're supposed to blow them up on sight. But my father did that out of a love he had for the people of Luxembourg. The Battle of the Bulge, some of the key areas were the town of Bastogne. My father was in these areas. There was something that my father had been a personal witness to, that was the recovery of the bodies of the victims of what was called the Malmedy massacre. My father was there. So whenever there were any Germans that were captured, my father was there to witness that. They lined the Germans up and went through their pockets. And if they found as much as one American cigarette, let alone a cigarette lighter, they shot him in the head. The word went out quickly to the Germans: you don't desecrate, you don't harm the bodies, you don't kill unarmed prisoners. And Patton brutally enforced that. My father had one best friend in the service, and his name was Dieter. And he was a German boy from the Pacific Northwest. He was a tall fellow. He was about 6'1", 6'2". My dad was probably about 5'9", probably like Mutt and Jeff. Dieter's job on the team was because he was German and from a German family, he was fluent in German. He was the translator. My father was an explosives fellow that could not only take apart mines, but he could also blow up things. So he was enlisted by the services of the CIC to basically blow open safes looking for Nazi documents. And it was about 6 years ago that I was at the Skirball Museum in Los Angeles, the Skirball Cultural Center, where they had the actual copy of the Nuremberg Laws signed by Hitler in September of 1935. And it said that it was found by 3 CIC agents, Dannenberg, Pearl, and Pickens, with the aid of some American GIs. To open a vault, anyone can do it with a lot of explosives, but to open a vault without destroying paper was a science. To have just the right amount of explosive at the right spots. The explosive that my dad used, he called it plastique. It's now known as C4, plastic explosive, was the explosive of choice of my father. One thing that was never disclosed at the museum was that the vault had been booby-trapped. It had a timing device. It was called a J-Fader 44. It was a 21-day timing device that you could set from 1 hour to 21 days. And it was set to go off on April 29th. That's when they presumed the Americans would get there. To destroy, they had a massive amount of explosives in that bank. My father was there on April 28th. So within 24 hours of the date of that explosion, when it should have gone off, they recovered the laws. Sergeant Golub, he was just a 21-year-old kid at the time that blew open the safe. The papers were first seen by Dieter. They were given over to Dannenberg. His translator, I think, was either Pearl or Pickens. They then took the documents and gave it to General Command, which went to General Patton. It stated what you could do as a Jew, what you couldn't do. You could not work. You cannot work for the government, certainly. Being a National Socialist country, every job was working for the government. So Jews were basically, it was now legal to exclude Jews from many occupations. My father was at multiple locations. One of them was the cathedral at St. Catherine, where the Spear of Longinus was found, that Hitler really venerated as a cult symbol of power. It was believed that anyone that possessed the spear would be indestructible in battle. And throughout the Middle Ages and throughout the years, it was believed that this was the sword which pierced the side of Jesus and had special mystical powers. Hitler was one that, especially as he was creating the Third Reich, meaning it was the third reign of the Roman Empire, thought if he had that spear, he would be indestructible against any armies in the world, and that with that he could take over the world. Patton wanted, just as he wanted the Nuremberg Laws, he wanted to take the Spear of Longinus back to the United States. And I believe it was General Eisenhower, who was the general commander, did not want it to leave the European theater, and made sure that it went back to its original home, which was back in Vienna, Austria. And this was something that was probably an issue between the generals. I know that my dad had incredible loyalty to Patton. He would walk on water for Patton. In his discussions, it was Dannenberg that really, I believe, had a dislike for Patton. He didn't believe that historical documents or items should leave Europe. They should be there to go back to their original homes, and it should be used for the trials that would be later used at the Nuremberg trials. He always mentioned to me later on that he really believed, had the war not ended with the nuclear bomb, that he was well on his way to being transferred over there. And he really believed that his capacity and the type of work he did had a very low survival rate. He was very blessed to survive what he did. Today they wear the hurt suit. My father wore nothing. It was just his little pink body against these devices. He would take his helmet off because he said because of the concussion effect, but it wouldn't matter if he had his helmet on or not if those devices went off. So he was very cognizant that he was going to be coming to the States, probably transferred overseas to the Pacific side, probably the West Coast, and would have gone on to the Pacific Theater. I also want to mention a little story about my grandfather, who is very special to me, who I never met. His name was Oscar Hertz. Oscar was taken by train along with other Jewish men into Poland. He was given a short period of time before they would be shooting these people. It was in Lithuania that there was a Japanese diplomat. His name was Chuni Sugihara. Chuni was the Japanese government's diplomat to Lithuania, which was at that time under the Russians, because at the time I believe the Germans gave the Baltic states to Russia before their attack of Russia. I knew that my grandfather went through Japan, but it was recently that I found out it was Ambassador Sugihara who wrote the affidavit, gave the visa for not only my grandfather, but approximately 2,000 Jews to leave Lithuania. The war was on in Europe, so the only way out was across Siberia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It was my grandmother who had contact with the Russian government that allowed the visa to be enforced to go across to Vladivostok. My grandmother had to pay 5 times the rate of other Russian citizens to travel on the trains, so she sold the remaining amount of her jewelry to buy the ticket for her husband to go across Siberia to Vladivostok, and eventually through one city to Kobe, Japan, and from Kobe he caught a freighter to San Francisco. He knew people because he was in the garment business that provided him with clothing and made the train trip from San Francisco, the Bay Area, to New York, where he met with his family. And sadly, 6 weeks later, he had been killed in a accident in New York. It's not that my family is special, it's that there are incredible stories about so many people of that World War II generation, of which my parents were just 2. It affected millions of people. Their stories a whole lot more important than this story, but each story, as we're losing these men and women of that generation, we're losing, I think, over 2,000 World War II veterans every day now. The simple stories of what the Sergeant Golubs and the Sergeant Bulows of the world do need to be told, because our young people today are the recipients of the sacrifices of that generation, and many of them don't know it. A lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of misery, a lot of uprooting, of people being forced out of homes and continents. And it goes on today where people will do anything for safety, for a job. They will compromise their morals, they will compromise their philosophy for a job, for safety. And there's certain things, like I learned from my grandmother, you don't compromise on. They can take everything from you, they can take your life, but they can't take what's inside of you. And that's very special.